Anything can happen between the time a contract is signed and the time the goods are transferred to the buyer's or lessee's possession. Goods can be subject to theft, damage, destroyed due to intentional conduct or mishandling. There's fires, floods, hurricanes. Acts of gods can damage or destroy goods. Sometimes the goods just disappear, leaving doubt as to what actually happened to them. When something like this happens, it's unfortunate. The goods are either left worthless or worth less, but somebody or some entity capable of owning property must suffer the loss or find another who is obligated to pay for the goods. The person who initially suffers the loss in value of the property is said to bear the risk of loss of those goods. The rules of the UCC about the rights and liabilities of the parties to a contract is what we will review, but in most situations, rights and liabilities are determined not by who has title or the right of ownership, but by three other concepts. First, identification. Two, the risk of loss. And three, insurable interest. And we know insurable interest is an interest with a legal right. It means that your interest is a legal right in having a legal right in something. Historically, courts settled disputes about one's interest by looking at title, but the drafters of the UCC found that title was too abstract of an answer in a number of situations. Sometimes it was hard to determine who had title. So now title is just one of the several components a court will use to resolve conflicting interests in goods. Let's talk about the first concept, identification. Identification in the sale or lease of goods is the express designation of the goods provided for in a contract. Before any interest in specific goods can pass from the seller or lessor to the buyer or lessee, the goods must exist and be identified as the specific goods designated in the contract. For example, 5,000 widgets. The risk of loss and title, if we're not talking about a lease title, cannot pass from the seller to buyer unless the goods are actually identified. Parties can agree in the contract when identification takes place, but if they don't, that's when the UCC provisions kick in and will provide for when identification happens. And that's going to depend on the goods. So, existing goods. Contract, when we have existing goods, contract calls for the sale or lease of specific goods that already exist. So a car dealer sells 5 cars bearing 5 different VIN numbers, one for each car on the lot. We have the car, we have the VIN numbers, they exist, they can be identified, existing goods. When we're dealing with future goods, goods that are not both existing and identified at the time of the contract or to the contract, some examples of that: unborn animals, crops that have to be harvested, goods that haven't even been made yet, they have to be made, those are future goods. Identification is going to take place as follows. When we're talking about animals, on conception is when identification takes place. If we're talking about crops, well, that are to be harvested within 12 months or the next harvest season, whichever's longer, identification happens when crops are planted. Otherwise, when they begin to grow. We'll do an example in a little bit. The other future goods, identification occurs when the goods are shipped, marked, or otherwise designated by the seller or lessor as the goods to which the contract refers. So let's take an example. It is January in northern New York, not a good time for growing plants. You own a co-op. You want to sell my organic lettuce I grow from the spring until the fall. We make a deal in January, but I don't plant until April, and then I plant throughout the season. I make a deal with you you make a deal with me to buy all the lettuce that season. When does identification happen? It is the next harvest season, and it is within 12 months, so when it's planted. So when I plant it, that's when identification happens. If it had already been planted, maybe I started it in a greenhouse in January, when it begins to show or when it grows is when that identification will occur. Other future goods, goods that are not identified yet. Identification occurs, like we said, when goods are shipped, marked, or otherwise designated by the seller as the goods to which the contract refers. So if you order a specific design t-shirt from me, they're not made yet. When they are made and I've marked them as, oh, these are your t-shirts, that's when we have identification. We also have this other idea for goods. Let's say we have goods that are already like existing, but they're from a larger mass. So for example, Aaron has a warehouse with 50,000 cases of widgets, and the buyer only wants to buy 5,000 cases of widgets from Aaron. We don't really know which 5,000 are the buyers yet, right? These are goods from a larger mass. The same rule applies. When the seller marks them, pulls them out, designates them as the particular goods and marks them for shipping, that's when we'll have identification if we have goods from a larger mass. We have an exception to our identification rule, and that's when we're dealing with fungible goods. Fungible goods are goods that are alike by physical nature, by agreement, or by trade usage. For example, oil of like quality and grade, wheat, flour, fuel, sugar, corn. We can't distinguish when they're put together. I think from a larger mass of goods, you can't pick out individual corn that came from you, right? So when we're dealing, so let's use this as an example. So we have Mark, Mary, and Madison. They're farmers. They deposit respectively 5,000 bushels, 3,000 bushels, and 2,000 bushels of the same grade and quality of grain in a bin. We're not going to be able to distinguish Mark's 5,000 from Madison's 2,000, right? So what happens is they become owners in common. So they own the grain as owners in common, which means owners with an undivided share of the hoe. So Mark owns 50%, Mary owns 30%, and Madison owns 20%. Mark contracts to sell 5,000 bushels of grain to Tony. Can he do that? Yes, he can. Does he have to remove the bushels from the bin? No. Tony just becomes an owner in common with Mary and Madison, replacing Mark and acquiring Mark's title. They will also share the risk due to their percentages, but we'll get there in a second. So next up, we're going to talk about title, then we'll talk about risk.